This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publication.
Welcome, everyone. And I'm very excited about the guest of today's episode. So we have Dr. Gareth Wiltshire, who is a social scientist and a lecturer at Loughborough University. Gareth has received his PhD from Loughborough University in 2014, and since then he has worked as a lecturer in 3 different universities in the UK before coming back to Loughborough in September this year. He has broad research interests related to social determinants of health, and he has, for example, written about the park run in the UK, and is also researching exercise and health for organ transplant recipients. However, what we are covering in today's episode is going to be his work related to qualitative research methodology. So welcome, Gareth.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
So, as a little bit of background, so I read your paper, A Case for Critical Realism in the Pursuit of Interdisciplinary and Impact. When it was published, that was around 2018. When was it out? In the spring or summer, right?
Yeah, I think it was in the spring that year, yeah.
Yeah, so I remember reading your paper and I was very excited that somebody is doing this work also in the field of sport, exercise and physical activity. And so since then, we actually met each other in a conference in Vancouver, the
That's
Qualitative
right.
Research in Sport and Exercise Conference in the summer 2018. And we actually collaborated in a couple of projects after that. So I do know a little bit about your research,
Yeah.
Probably more than the listeners today.
Yeah.
So would you just first tell us a little bit about that paper, The Case for Critical Realism, how this paper came into being and what are you arguing for in this paper?
Yeah, so that, I suppose, was my first attempt to do a single-authored paper. I'm an early career researcher and I kind of wanted to write something on my own, and it was really to choose to do that was really an attempt to get out, put into words, and to develop some ideas on something that had been quite interesting to me for several years, but it was one of those things which I felt like I hadn't really read enough about in the field. I felt like it was something that I didn't hear about the ideas and arguments coming from many of my colleagues, for example. And I wanted to have these conversations with fellow qualitative researchers, and I'd, go through the textbooks, go through the published papers debating these issues. And I didn't really see much about critical realism, or when it was mentioned, it was kind of mentioned in passing without much sort of thorough debate. So I suppose I wanted to write about critical realism, which is my kind of core motivation. But of course, just writing about critical realism for the sake of it is sort of pointless, because those the information is already out there in different fields, and the key authors who have developed the approach I've already done that stuff. So I wanted to link it to, why do I really find it important? What's the kind of the core things about this approach which I think it brings value to my own thinking and my own work? And I decided to link it with the ideas of interdisciplinarity, so working across disciplines in academia, and impact. And these are 2 things that are being pushed for, I think, in academia in general, and certainly in the UK in the context where I'm working. But I don't think that we necessarily have the tools or or sometimes even the kind of the motivation and the shared assumptions which actually encourage interdisciplinary work, and neither do we necessarily work on things that have impact at their core as one of their sort of primary components. So for me, those two things are things which have been sort of focused through my work on my thinking with critical realism. So that's the kind of key motivation behind it.
Yeah. So if we think of physical activity and exercise research, we often see that things are kind of done in their own pockets. So you have the qualitative researchers doing their own work, and then you have like physiological approaches, and then you have as if psychology and sociology would be doing kind of their own approaches and almost as if their own topics as well. So
exactly.
in terms of interdisciplinarity, why do you see critical realism as something that might help us to develop these dialogues?
Well, I suppose along with the types of things that people study within different disciplines, there's also ways of studying within different disciplines. And it's really the focus on the ways that different disciplines have developed that was the focus of this. And I suspect that this is largely a social process which happens where people are socialized into different disciplines, and there are certain norms which become the taken for granted ways of doing things in different disciplines. And in my experience, I suppose I read most closely sociology, and I'd kind of go to conferences and talk to PhD students and lecturers and kind of read what everyone was doing. And the norm for me was certainly one that is around qualitative methods. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that I remember going to a conference once and someone sort of standing up and they were defending, they were trying to present some survey work they'd done, and there was a critical comment about the use of survey work within the social sciences, and they kind of held their hand up and said, look, this wasn't my part of the study. I'm a sociologist. I use qualitative methods. I'm a sociologist. I don't use surveys. Mm-hmm. So that was an example of the norms within that, which kind of assumed that qualitative methods are the way of doing things. Now, of course, there's lots of sociologists who have used quantitative methods and do continue to use quantitative methods. But in the area, in the field that I was working, that there's certainly an assumption that was not the way to do things. And people who did use quantitative methods, I certainly got the sense were seen as the people who were who maybe sold out, or the people who were a little bit naive or closed-minded, or too kind of objectivist, not open-minded enough to see the world in qualitative ways. So for me, there's lots of differences between different disciplines, but coming at it from my perspective and coming at it from my own kind of biography, growing and learning about this stuff, it certainly was that was the norm. And so for me, there are probably lots of good reasons for this. But for me, I kind of wanted to push back on that a little bit, and I wanted to kind of question that assumption, and that I saw as a bit of a barrier to me. So if I, for example, in that context, would have wanted to do a survey, I would have been sort of slowly and subtly persuaded that it's not the right way to go. And that's just one little example, but there's probably lots of other different examples which kind of build up in your head, and you begin to build a framework and an architecture around your conceptual thinking around what it is to do research in your field. Mm-hmm. And for me, a lot of this was related to this disciplinary approach, and something which I've come to see as quite problematic.
Right. And yeah, when you are talking about qualitative researchers and they kind of clearly think, some of them think that this is the right way of doing research and this is the best way of doing research. So that's something that comes across as in some of the literature, that there is such thing as the qualitative paradigm, which has its own assumptions and its own ways of working and own ways of thinking about research in itself. And that's something that you're also challenging in your paper. Kind of this idea that qualitative research would be one paradigm of its own. So
that's right, yeah. And it's an interesting one because, as I said, I'm taking this from my own perspective and my own experience, but it's quite possible that the opposite happens for other people. You know, there might be people in disciplines where statistics and quantitative ways of working and experimental designs are very much the norm, and someone who might want to do something more qualitative might equally be kind of socialized out of it and told that it's not a good idea to do that. So that probably does happen on different sides. So it's important to mention that. But certainly for me, as I was describing that the experience in social science in sport, much of this was labeled as being in this qualitative paradigm, and this is, you know, a contested term. I think not everyone fully subscribes to this, but it's one of those things which you do hear quite a lot. And so this way of approaching research for me is underpinned by often people talk about relativist notions of truth. So that people, you can quote people by saying qualitative researchers believe not in one truth but multiple truths. People talk about multiple internal realities, mind-dependent realities. People will use the labels constructivism and interpretivism quite a lot. And crucially, even the label of the qualitative paradigm puts it in opposition with quantitative research methods. So it begins to create an assumption that qualitative and quantitative methods are somehow incompatible. They do not live in the same world. They shouldn't be used at the same time. They shouldn't be used by the same under the same research assumptions or philosophical assumptions of the researcher.
So you have to be either or.
Yes,
that you have a strong identity as I'm a qualitative researcher, or I'm a quantitative researcher, and that's who you are. That's what you believe in.
Absolutely, I think that's something which does happen, and I'm not sure in what fields that happens in more than others, but certainly in my field there is a sense that, and there's a tendency to also use things like people might say qualitative with a big Q and qualitative with a small q. I've heard that used quite a lot recently. So the idea that people can do qualitative research, but there's even within that there's proper qualitative researchers who are using the qualitative with a big Q, and not qualitative researchers, but they're not properly doing it, which is qualitative with a small q. So I suspect people do start to identify with these methods, and they do start to position themselves within academia in alignment with these particular methods. It's attached to a worldview and a basic belief system, fundamental belief system, which people often refer to. And the other thing which is probably worth thinking about within this space is that there's a history in academia of qualitative methods perhaps not being taken as seriously as quantitative methods. You know, it's not sort of proper science, and there's an undercurrent of politics related to maybe getting qualitative methods taken more seriously in academia. So I think
absolutely.
If you talk about, you know, identity and people wanting to build a position and build an argument for qualitative methods, I can easily see how your identity may become a bit stronger if it's not taken seriously by other people, and you don't get published in certain journals. There's lots of journals that don't really accept qualitative methods. So I can see how that can really start to magnify differences or potentially exaggerate differences between these methods.
Yeah, and I think for qualitative researchers, when their work is being rejected, then you often easily get a bit defensive, and then you are kind of working to show how the quantitative researchers are reductionist and they don't understand the complexity of this issue, and kind of all sorts of things that you can kind of make this polar opposites of we are more sophisticated with our methods and with our philosophy and with our ways of thinking. So yeah, I think it's part of this kind of always having to defend that it's proper research, even if I had only 10 participants, as opposed to having a big sample and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. I think the sample size is something which is people come back to quite often, and perhaps also the idea that this might, people may disagree with this, but it potentially qualitative methods is easy to do. So, for example, having a conversation with someone and trying to understand their experience is something that most people do on a daily basis. And people are quite skilled in doing that, and observing other people, and maybe reading a book and trying to interpret what the author was thinking. These are all interpretive acts which we're human brains are very well equipped to do. So it's almost that it's almost too easy to do in comparison to qualitative methods, which is maybe more quantitative methods where you have to maybe go through a course and you've taught at university, so it's got an air of being more kind of advanced and proper, which of course has no relation to whether it's actually useful or not, but it may be more difficult to do, but less useful, for example. But actually the fact that it's difficult to do may bring a certain level of kudos to it in the same way that qualitative methods may not.
Yeah, I get the point that you just go and talk to people and then you report what they've said, or that's the impression that you might get if you haven't kind of been involved in qualitative research and how complicated it actually can be.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just kind of saying that maybe all this kind of builds into this thing which we are talking about, which is a qualitative paradigm, and how it comes to be something which needs to be defended, and something which people can get very people begin to identify with very strongly.
Yeah.
This podcast is sponsored by Fibion. Fibion is an accurate sitting and physical activity tracking device and analysis platform. It is a great tool for projects that aim for behaviour change in sedentary behaviour and incidental physical activity. Fibion provides easy-to-understand PDF and web browser reports for participants. Other features include comparisons to recommendations, linking results to health risks, achievement cards, and interactive goal-setting tool. In addition, Fibion provides an API that allows for easy integration to other systems and applications. Learn more about Fibion at fibion.com/research. Fibion, from researchers to researchers.
So, you already mentioned about that kind of in qualitative research, we often talk about relativism, we often talk about constructivism. There are different approaches. We could talk about critical approaches, postmodern, post-structuralist approaches, and so forth. And I guess one of the most challenging things for a qualitative researcher, especially in the early career phase, is to kind of figure out how you position yourself with so many different approaches and kind of different ways of conceptualizing qualitative research and what we're trying to do as well. So I guess just kind of your own reflections on your own journey and how you were socialized in qualitative research in the first place and how you started shifting away from that. I think that might be useful for some of the listeners who might be now developing their own approach and kind of figuring out where they sit in terms of these paradigms and these approaches.
Yeah, well, as I guess I've already touched on slightly, that I suppose I began my journey, and I suppose we can go back to probably not undergraduate, because that's probably not as relevant. Although it's worth mentioning that at undergraduate, the courses that I'm familiar with across a few different universities, you do tend to get taught in a way which maybe first year you're exposed to both qualitative and quantitative methods, but soon when you start to get into your second year, certainly third year, the cohort of students does split between qualitative on the one hand and quantitative methods on the other hand. So, I went down the qualitative route because I was studying sociology, a bit of philosophy, and it was a coaching science course, in sports coaching at Cardiff Metropolitan University. But I suppose as I got more into thinking in a more advanced way as a researcher, I suppose that was my master's, and I was certainly taught this stuff we're talking about around the qualitative paradigm, and then into my PhD, I was certainly along that line as well. I remember it's hard to think back, but I do distinctly remember in my interview for my PhD, where I remember declaring that I was methodologically an anti-realist. And I was part of this qualitative paradigm. It was part of one of those things that I'd been taught and a way to approach things. So then I know that by the end of my first year as a PhD student, I was not an anti-realist, and I was beginning to read more. So somewhere in between the interview for my PhD and the end of my first year, I became or was much more convinced by critical realism. So looking back, I mean, what happened in that first year? I think the way that I like to learn things is to try and do a lot of thinking on my own. I try and sort of write notes and jot things down, and if things don't really fit with me, I prefer not to sort of rote learn something and then kind of just talk about things in that they've been written about and kind of just quote other people. I really need to try and make sure I understand it myself. So I remember reading the justifications around why qualitative methods is grounded in philosophical assumptions, and and I was trying to work it out myself, trying to understand it, and they didn't really fit with me. They didn't seem to make too much sense. I came across a paper by Mike Weed in I think the journal is the Qualitative Research in Sport and Exercise, and that paper was around grounded theory, and within that, critical realism was introduced to me. And at the same time, there was a lecturer at Loughborough. Is Professor Paul Downward. He's written about critical realism. So I kind of remember going down a little bit of a rabbit hole and wanting to learn a little bit more about this. And it was one of those things where I just felt like it made much more sense to me. And if that feeling where you're kind of you're opening the door to something and it becomes, you open it further and further, and you see there's a kind of big world out there of people who are writing about critical realism, and I wanted to explore that further. And since then, I suppose I've been writing about it, talking about it more, and coming across other people who've gone through a similar journey. I'm learning a lot from plenty of other people about it as well. So. I suppose that was my journey. So I certainly went from the kind of interpretivist qualitative paradigm side of things to a critical realism side of things at some point during my PhD. So I suppose, if I had any reflections on other people trying to make sense of this stuff. What I'd say, just thinking about other colleagues, other early career researchers, other PhD students that I'm now supervising and talking to, maybe people who I'm not supervising. I think it's important to make sure you're thinking for yourself, trying to think through these things. I think it's probably very easy to follow a kind of textbook definition and off-the-shelf philosophical justification for your work, just because it's one of those things which you're told to write. At some point in your PhD thesis, you're going to have to write something about philosophy. So the easiest thing to do is to kind of take it off the shelf and write about it like that. I would, I'd ask. I think it's a good idea to avoid that and make sure you kind of think through things yourself. And in the same way, I think following your supervisor is probably not automatically the best thing to do. I think making sure that you're not just following the justifications just because your supervisor tells you it's the best thing to do as well. I think that's an important thing to remember. I think a lot of when you read around the philosophical assumptions, a lot of it tends to, from my perspective, I think a lot of it does tend to oversimplify the argument on the opposite side. So creating straw person arguments of other paradigms, I think, is quite common. I think actually wanting to question those and actually wanting to meet those people. For example, if you wanted to critique the way that quantitative researchers think about things, you might read that in a textbook, but it's then a good idea to actually go and talk to someone who does quantitative methods and saying, does this represent you? Do you think you've found truth in your methods? Are you an objectivist? So I think actually meeting them and going out of your way to actually have conversations with real people, as opposed to creating abstract caricatures, I think would be a really good way of breaking down these kind of imagined boundaries between people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think one of the things that is probably kind of preventing people from engaging with critical realism is that how it's often represented in qualitative research textbooks and also articles, and especially in the qualitative work that is done in sport, exercise, and health, is often kind of that critical realism is something that is close to positivism, and it's kind of what you already mentioned about objectivism, and there is a truth that can be discovered. That's kind of something that always comes across. So I think one of those things that you already mentioned about talking to people, but also making sure that you read texts that are produced by scholars who are within these different approaches. So you're reading about critical realism through somebody's work who is actually working within that approach.
Yeah.
So, because I think for me as well, kind of what was a challenge as well was trying to figure out that, because there are so many different representations, and how it's taken up in qualitative research in sport, exercise, and health is very much kind of that it's a form of positivism and something that is kind of left, that we shouldn't kind of, it's so gone by now that it's like we have moved on, and now the new thing is this qualitative paradigm. So ways of using language as well.
Is
outdated. Yeah. So I mean, we might have somebody listening who never heard about critical realism, so maybe you just want to say a few words about what is this whole thing about?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I don't want immediately set out by saying it's too complicated, because I really don't think it is. And quite simply, critical realism, for me, well, if you take the word realism, realism is essentially the assumption there's a real world that exists which is outside of our knowledge. I think this is a generally agreed assumption within the realist school of thought. So a nice simple example in the physical world might be that the world is a globe shape, as far as we know anyway. I think that's a fairly robust knowledge claim to make, but let's say that it is the shape of a globe. There was a time in human history where everyone thought it was flat. Everyone assumed it was flat. So people's knowledge of the world went from being flat to being a globe over a couple of 100 years or so. But the actual status of the world didn't change during that time. Okay, so it was actually a globe shape. It was actually round, whether we thought it was flat or not. So there's a separation between the way the world actually is, so the real world, and what we think of it, our knowledge of it. So this is a kind of a basic assumption. It sounds quite common sense, and I think that's how most people go about their daily lives. They assume there is a real world that exists. So it almost feels like it shouldn't need to be stated, but I suppose it does need to be stated if you go and look into the challenges of that. So it's actually quite difficult to prove or confirm there's a real world that exists outside of our knowledge. But that's the basic thing. That's the basic realist assumption. So I suppose some people are happy to use the term realism, and increasingly I'm comfortable using the term realism. But critical realism generally hints at the idea that yes, there is a world out there, but we also need to be conscious that we can never fully know it. We can never fully understand it. All of our ideas about that world are dependent on the concepts and theories that we have about it. So we always have to kind of update things. We don't live in absolute certainty about that real world. So critical realism is kind of sits nicely with my understanding of that. Now, there's obviously lots of different versions of this, lots of different schools of thought. But I suppose I began reading in the tradition of Roy Bhaskar, and then developed by people like Margaret Archer, Andrew Sayer, and authors like that. And they kind of joined two words from Bhaskar. There was a term, critical naturalism, and transcendental realism was a different term. So it was a kind of combination of those two terms, really. So not necessarily the way that I just described it. But I think the way that I've described it is probably, I don't think many of you would necessarily disagree with that definition I provided.
Yeah, so basically what you are telling is that we had different ideas about what the world is like. At some point of time, the people thought that the earth is flat. But at some point, as we now know, that they were actually mistaken. So our knowledge can refer to the world for better or worse. Sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes we are gathering more evidence that indicates that we might be right. But we can always gather more knowledge that will kind of show that actually we were wrong again.
Yeah.
So it's something that kind of keeps developing. So I think your example is something that is quite easy to understand to people. But what happens is when we move to qualitative research, it gets a bit more complicated, right? So can you, if I'm a physical activity researcher and working with qualitative methods, let's say I'm doing interviews with people to figure out when they are doing exercise and why they're doing it, and kind of understand motivational issues surrounding that. So how does that critical realist approach kind of inform what I'm doing? What does it imply for my research?
Yeah, well, I think there's the potential, the difficulty in things like this is it's never really, you can never be totally sure that you've understood what someone else is thinking, what someone else's experience is like, what it's like to be that person who's trying to exercise. So obviously this is what we're trying to find out. If you interview someone and you might say, let's say, for example, a common problem with, you might be interested in people who are obese and they're trying to get into exercise. Their experience of exercise might be one which presents lots and lots of barriers. They may feel shame. They may feel like they're physically unable. They may feel pain in certain ways. They may feel very self-conscious. And they can tell us these things. We may not be 100% certain that what we've understood from what they've told us is exactly what they are experiencing. So the challenge that you usually get to in qualitative research is that if you have, let's say, two researchers and they are interviewing or doing some research on this one participant, they may interpret what has been said in different ways. So one of them may say, they haven't engaged in their physical activity this week. They haven't engaged in the intervention. Why is that? And one person might say, well, it's because they don't have the right motivation, or because they their attitude is wrong, something like that. And then the second researcher may interpret what they've said and said, oh, actually, if you listen to what they've said, they are trying, but they're experiencing this shame or this stigma or pain or something like this. So that you may get two different interpretations of the one experience. Now, the slippage for me in this qualitative paradigm is to take those two different interpretations and to treat them as just different interpretations, and they're both equally valid, and they're both there's no way of adjudicating between them, because the researcher has tried their best to interpret and understand the situation, and they've just come up with two different interpretations. For me, what thinking in the realist sense is to remember that the participants' experiences are the things that are real. They're the things that exist outside of the researcher's knowledge. So if they disagree, if the interpretations are in disagreement, it's probably important to at some point think that they're either both partial. One may have misrepresented, one may have misunderstood, one may have got the situation totally wrong, one may have got it totally right, one may have got it partially right. But there's something going on outside of these interpretations. There's this external point of reference, which is the actual experience of the participant, who we need to go back to. We need to start questioning our experiences and move towards an attempt to represent the actual experiences of what's actually happened. So essentially, our qualitative data within this critical realist thinking is an attempt to describe what's going on in the actual world, the real world, or come up with a theory which attempts to represent something that's actually happening in the real world. So this is the kind of realist attempt. And that sounds quite, again, like a sort of straightforward, common sense example. And I think in reality, a lot of people would probably do their qualitative research like this. But you get a sense in a lot of work within the qualitative paradigm that any adjudication between interpretations is either an impossible task, or it's too difficult to do, or it's simply that there isn't anything outside of our own interpretation. So we might as well leave it there and just acknowledge that this is just one interpretation. For me, I think we need to be more rigorous, and our ultimate goal is to get as close to that that actual real world experience as we can.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that we are taking up in the paper that we wrote together about validity in qualitative research, and the problem that if you are adhering to a relativist approach, it's very difficult to say why are you preferring your interpretation or your explanation over your co-researcher's interpretation or the interpretation of the participant. And we come to the kind of question like whose reality actually counts if there are those multiple realities. So whose reality are we kind of writing up in the paper and whose reality is not going in? Like what's the reason?
Exactly. And I think it was important to distinguish between perhaps the way that people actually do things and the way that people actually carry out their qualitative work versus the way that people talk about it, because I think we don't want to get into a danger of creating these straw person accounts of how other people do things. So as we said, we're referring to the qualitative paradigm, but we've also started touching on this idea of relativism and constructivism and interpretivism, which are somewhat linked concepts. And one of the dangers is maybe saying that they treat all accounts as equally valid, and even though that's something which they may not do in reality, it's certainly conceptually not part of the language and certainly not part of the tools which are prominent within the qualitative paradigm. As you're not left with much to adjudicate between these different interpretations, whereas this realist thinking, this assumption there is something outside of our interpretation that we're trying to get as close to as possible. We're trying to this is quite a straightforward, simple concept of validity. Is something which actually becomes quite important and quite useful in these sticking points.
Mm-hmm.
This podcast is sponsored by Fibion. Fibion is an accurate sitting and physical activity tracking device and analysis platform. It is a great tool for projects that aim for behaviour change in sedentary behaviour and incidental physical activity. Fibion provides easy-to-understand PDF and web browser reports for participants. Other features include comparisons to recommendations, linking results to health risks, achievement cards, and interactive goal-setting tool. In addition, Fibion provides an API that allows for easy integration to other systems and applications. Learn more about Fibion at fibion.com/research. Fibion, from researchers to researchers.
And I think also one thing that we might want to touch upon is kind of the very fundamental, what's the aim of qualitative research in the first place? So are we trying to describe people's experiences, or are we trying to do something more? So what would be the critical realist approach? What are you trying to achieve if you're doing a qualitative study?
Yeah, so I think that if you're trying to describe things, I think that's an important part of it. And for me, that's the kind of the bread and butter, the kind of basic things that most qualitative researchers would want to do. So if you do an interview with someone, you want to make sure that you are able to describe what they said to you, accurately. Or if you do an ethnography and you want to know what it's like to be in a particular community and you spend a lot of time with them, you want to actually be able to describe what it's like to be in that community. And you could say the same with a whole bunch of different qualitative methods. But within the critical realist approach, you do want to do more than that. There's a big emphasis on explanation. So not only describing what's going on, but beginning to generate some theories, which maybe don't need to be taken as kind of grand frameworks and grand theories, but usually taken more as either middle range theories or explanations, which help you explain why things are going on. So, for example, if you take gender inequality or the gendered experience in sport, it's quite common that so it's a commonly held understanding that young girls may be persuaded not to do sport and physical activity in comparison to their male counterparts, to the boys in school, for example. So you might want to, if you were to do some qualitative research with boys and girls in school, you may want to describe how their experiences are different, and they may be able to tell you on an individual level what their life is like, and the girl may tell you that she doesn't feel comfortable in physical education. She doesn't feel confident in the after school club, those sorts of things. She might be able to tell you her kind of lived experience of what it's like in spaces of physical activity. But then the next step then is to go beyond that description and try and explain why she may be feeling uncomfortable or unconfident in those spaces. So that is related to kind of causal explanations, and it's usually a matter of inference with things that you can't necessarily observe. So this is where in critical realism they describe the world in different kind of domains and say there are things that are observable. So if a girl who's going to an after school club explains and describes her experience as being one that she doesn't feel comfortable or confident, that's something which we can capture. But if you're wanting to say why she doesn't feel like that, it may be that we have to theorize beyond our empirical observations. We may have to make inferences outside of that. And that's really the most important, the kind of most celebrated aspect of the research endeavor, is attempting to find these regularities and then trying to explain them. And of course, as we've said before, our knowledge of them, because it won't necessarily be empirically based, may be a subject to interpretation. But it's important not to, you don't just take that interpretation and stop there. You have to continually question your interpretation, seek new evidence, seek new data, and try and explain all the data in a way which is helpful, and we can fully understand the social situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think when you're putting it this way, what seems quite different from qualitative research as it comes through from many textbooks is that there isn't a lot of emphasis on you as a researcher. So we are kind of taught to think about qualitative research as you are very much involved as a kind of person in creating the findings, and it's your construction and it's your reflexivity that needs to go in. So can you tell me a bit how you think about your role as a researcher when you're doing critical realist work?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I think it's important to acknowledge that you know, you will always play a role in the data that you produce as a person. But I think perhaps it's just about levels of emphasis. But I tend to see my own role as something which ultimately, you know, I would like to try and remove as much as possible. I'd like to think that if someone else came into and conducted the same study, if they had the same research question and they were trying to understand the experience of girls in school and trying to understand that, or understand why certain overweight or obese people are struggling to get physically active, they are striving to find the experiences of those participants, and they if we've got it right, then someone else would find the same thing, and that's another a useful way of thinking about it for me. It's another way of helping to gain confidence in whether our findings are more or less valid than others or not. So for me, yes, you reflect, but I think the reflection is largely about untangling any problems with your involvement, and what is, I suppose, become a little bit of a dirty word within this qualitative paradigm, which is bias. And I do think that is something which is sort of rejected, because you can't, we're not attempting to remove our biases. Because sometimes our personal involvement is precisely something which actually leads to really good, rich research. Because we are maybe we're invested in it, or maybe we can see things that other people can't. This hypothetical other researcher to come in, they may not see the same things. So there's certainly value in bringing your own involvement in there. But ultimately, if you're aiming to, if you're working towards, and here's the other contentious word, which is truth. If you're aiming to find the truth of the phenomena, then your own involvement is not something which is important. So I think there's a danger in slipping towards narcissism when we are thinking around our own interpretation and our own value in producing research. We need to acknowledge it, but at the same time, it's not about us. Ultimately, the research is not about us as the researcher. The research is about the phenomenon and the people that you're studying, and the mechanisms and the causes of the social problems that we see in the world. And that needs to be the most important thing that we need to remind ourselves.
Yeah, and when you mentioned about what critical realism or research that is drawing on critical realism, so they're trying to produce explanations, theoretical explanations of why things are happening the way they are happening. And so with your theory, you would then hope others to test the theory or refine the theory and see whether it helps us to understand what's going on. So that would be something that is going on regardless of whether you as a person, as a researcher, are kind of studying it or not. So it's not just your understanding of what's going on, but it's an understanding that other researchers can kind of come to the same conclusions.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think it's one of these things which becomes, I'm not quite sure why, but it becomes an assumption that this idea of different perspectives being important, and we always interpret things. It is something which has become on the side of what's the word? Maybe the innovative thinkers, people who are maybe more open-minded, maybe socially conscious, people interested in inequalities and social justice. It's become part of that lexicon, that language. But I think what's really interesting is that we've seen that the same tools can be used for people who are not interested in social justice, fairness, equality. The very same, as we're in the sort of post-truth era, so-called, the perspective approach can be used by people in positions of power to actually dismiss interpretations, and we see that within feminist movements. People arguing against feminism may say that, look, this is just your perspective. You're coming at this from a feminist perspective, so your feminist views are not valued for me. For me, I think you need to be able to say that no, that there is. You need to be. The more confident you are, and the more you attempt to actually say that patriarchy is something which is real. For example, gender pay inequality is true. These are quite helpful things which have social justice goals, and I think those kind of truth claims around them are actually quite useful. So we've got very fun and interesting election going on in the UK. I don't know if you've been following it, but there was
definitely, yes.
Michael Gove is a senior Conservative politician, and he was a journalist asked him to defend a claim recently that the Conservatives are making around building hospitals. So the claim was that the Conservatives plan to build or that are building 40 new hospitals. And then after some interrogation by journalists and other MPs, it turns out that this is actually 6 new hospitals. And then the number 40 refers to seed funding investment for business plans for 40 hospitals. So it's quite a different statement to make that we're building 40 hospitals to we're providing the seed funding for business plans for 40 hospitals. But my point is that when Michael Gove, the Conservative politician, was being confronted with this, his defence was, look, this question is a liberal left-wing question, and your viewers need to understand that you're coming at this from a certain perspective. So when challenged on something which was shown to be a politician lying about something, his defence, and one which can sometimes be quite convincing, was this multiple truths, this perspectivalism, which was used as a defence. So for me, this is as an example of how ideas of truth or beliefs in truths are actually quite useful for maybe social justice goals and the way that the nature of things are. We need to make these statements about the world and not necessarily slip into the idea that there are multiple realities, multiple truths, and everything is a matter of perspective. I think there's a dark side to this, which I think we're experiencing now.
Yeah, and I think that also comes through when you look at qualitative research, and there's a lot of talk about different paradigms, and different paradigms are producing different knowledge claims that need to be evaluated within the criteria of that paradigm. So basically what you are arguing for is something that kind of applies within that paradigm, but not necessarily the other. And this is a very confusing and complicated situation for qualitative researchers and for research community as a whole. If there is nothing that we can kind of generalize in terms of how to evaluate qualitative research, that everything depends on how the researchers are approaching the questions or their own paradigm. So that kind of means that if I'm in a different paradigm from where you are, then I cannot kind of evaluate the quality of your work.
Yeah, I can. I absolutely. I think I'd say because ultimately, as much as we can talk about multiple realities between different people, I think it's important to mention that maybe we have some different realities, in terms of our own personal experience. But I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I think we live in the same reality. I think we live in the same physical reality. We live in the same conceptual reality. We live in the same society. And when we need to, the most important thing is that we usually work with the same participants or the same population that we're talking about. So suddenly they are the most important thing because they exist in the real world. So if two people from different paradigms have conflicting advice for those real people, then we're into a bit of trouble, I think. So yeah, being able to, if they give different advice, it's not necessarily an excellent solution just to be able to say, well, if you're in the critical paradigm, then you should do this. But if you're in the relativist paradigm, you should do this. They're not in a paradigm. They're in the real world, and they want to know whose advice to take. So I think, we do have this situation where we're attempting to increase the diversity of approaches. We're trying to acknowledge that different people do things in different ways, but it really has its limits, this explanation, and it gets into sticking points when we do try and give advice in the real world to practical people who don't care about our paradigms that we've invented. And then also the other thing is I suppose the other things are related to peer reviewing. So if people from 2 different paradigms or 3 different paradigms are reviewing your study, it's very difficult for them to for them to use their perspectives in order to judge the quality of it. And then the last issue would be for me, which is quite important, is trying to do a synthesis of different studies. So if you're doing a meta study, review, a literature review, or some sort of synthesis of different studies, you have to have some way of making sense of different studies that are in different paradigms. And once we have understood that, and if you are able to make sense of it and reconcile it, then for me that kind of shows that there's no need for different paradigms in the first place. If you're able to reconcile them when you're kind of looking at multiple studies, you should easily be able to do it within one study as well.
Yeah. So let's go into that in a moment. I guess one of the things that is worth mentioning here is that critical realists don't kind of assume that there is only one correct explanation, right? So when we are talking about there are competing interpretations and different explanations, so basically because of the constructivist epistemology that we never know exactly how the world it is as it is, so we always have different theories, and it might be that we have several theories that all can tell us something about the phenomenon and that can actually be valid at the same time. So I think that's one of the kind of accusations against critical realism sometimes. That kind of that there would be this positivist assumption that there is one correct explanation and everything else is wrong.
Yeah, and when I've heard critiques, I think sometimes it's related to the assumption that if you're a realist and you think you've found the answer, that you think you have the answer, you think that you have somehow achieved that full understanding of the real world. But actually, as we said at the beginning, and you've just described there, there's no arrogance associated with this critical realist thinking, because you just assume that it's there. It's a kind of belief in truth, not a truth necessarily. So you believe there's a truth to be found, and you'll attempt to reach it, get close to it as much as possible, and that is your key sort of drive. But in order to do that, you have to come up with a nice clear explanation of what you think is happening, and then that needs to be exposed to critique. It needs to be exposed to people disputing it, and people criticizing that, and trying to see the flaws and see the problems in that truth claim. And that's how you kind of make some progress. So without doing that, I think you don't necessarily move much closer to better knowledge. So some interpretations are better than others, but at the same time, you may not feel like you have actually got there.
Yeah.
This podcast is sponsored by Fibion, a research device that has been shown to be valid in tracking sitting, standing, physical activity and energy expenditure. Get scientific validation and learn more about Fibion at fibion.com/research.
So, I mean, you started mentioning about synthesizing different studies and kind of the possibility or impossibility of doing that. So I mean, if you work from a realist perspective, how would you go about that?
So a good way of going about it is usually starting with coming up with candidate theories. So if you have a particular explanation that you have in your mind, you know what you think is going on. This kind of begins as a candidate theory. So remember, theories become, and explanations become the ultimate, one of the ultimate goals of what you're trying to achieve. And essentially, what you're looking at, rather than trying to summarize what's going on in the literature, your attempt then is to seek evidence from the literature to try and either support or refute or revise your the theory and the explanation that you've come up with. So you begin with thinking becomes the most important thing. Okay? Thinking, theorizing, philosophizing, trying to explain what's going on becomes the core undertaking, and then literature is then used as evidence selectively in the attempt to like I said, trying to improve and help you refine that theory. So that's where we might be coming right back to the beginning now. That's where different methods, so qualitative and quantitative methods, actually become really useful, because you're not beginning with the methods as part of your paradigm. What you're thinking with is through the theory, through the explanation that you've got in your head. And different types of methods can be really useful to you in helping refute those, or helping you refine those theories.
So are you involved in this kind of work at the moment, or something you're planning to do?
Something that I am planning to do, yes. We've begun a realist synthesis. So if people wanted to look up further about these methods, there's lots of excellent guidelines and descriptions out there by realist researchers. So a recent book came out called Doing Realist Research, and that's quite useful. There's I suppose even before that, there's a project led by people like Justin Jagosh and Jeff Wong, called the Ramesses Project. So if you search for Ramesses, you'll be able to find not only the development of realist synthesis and realist evaluation, but what's been developed as reporting standards. So not only how to do it, but how to do it well. You know, what are the publishing standards for these sorts of methods? So they are out there, and they're very accessible. And I think increasingly being used in social sciences in order to do this synthesis of work, but also evaluation work. So shall I mention the realist evaluation work as well then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So on that, so just to slip from that realist synthesis to realist evaluation. So evaluation is so developed by Pawson and Tilley, and perhaps more taken on a little bit more by Ray Pawson, as a way of a method for evaluating real world interventions, real world programs, and I think really coming from a critique of randomized control trials. So this is an idea of where maybe you've got a new way of doing things, a new intervention in the real world. You might want to put CCTV cameras up in a school to reduce reduce vandalism or something like that. And you might want to see how well that works. So a randomized controlled trial might have 10 schools where they put CCTV cameras up, and 10 schools that don't put CCTV cameras up. and then see whether you reduce vandalism. And you may conclude from that putting CCTV cameras up do actually reduce vandalism in these schools where it, on average, it reduced vandalism. So the assumption then is that what you can do is you can then generalize that finding, and you can assume that the CCTV cameras actually have an impact, and they actually have this causal power to reduce vandalism in schools. But that and many other different programs and interventions come under a bit of trouble when you try and put that into a new school and a new context, and it doesn't work quite the same way. And maybe it doesn't work for everyone in exactly the same way. And maybe you can't average out all the different schools because the extent to which it worked was quite different. So the mantra for realist evaluation is not does this work or not, ultimately coming to a p-value and being able to claim significance. The ultimate aim is to say what works for whom, in what circumstances, and how. So it becomes a little bit more complicated, but what that does is it says that, well, actually, it's not going to work for everyone. So we need to find out, in what different groups, what different people, what different schools is this going to work? Is there something within the context which works with the CCTV cameras? So maybe the context might be the teachers who are there, the particular socio-demographic population of the schools, the recent history of the schools. There's something in that context which combines with the CCTV cameras as a mechanism. So it's not the CCTV cameras on their own; it's the context with the cameras, and they help to produce the outcome. So it's a refined version of a way to evaluate how interventions work in the real world. And I think this would be really, really interesting to see this more in physical activity research, which, as far as I can see, seems to be dominated by interventions which are evaluated using RCTs, and usually they are, it comes to a kind of bottom line conclusion whether this intervention worked or not. Does it work in this school? Does it work in this population? Does it work in this neighborhood? Something like that. And the attempt is to try and isolate the causal force of this brand new intervention and whether it works or not. When actually it may be more appropriate to say that this intervention works for some people, and some people in this particular context, and it's partly this context which makes it work or not. And we can help to maybe try and explain why it works. Because I guess that last thing is, why it works is coming back to this causal explanation idea. Because there are many, many experimental methodologies many experimental studies which come to a conclusion about whether something's worked or not, and people don't actually know why. So it's either it has worked, but they're not really sure why it worked, or it hasn't worked, and they're not really sure why. And that is a really, really crucial but missing component of experimental studies. And maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh now, because some can be quite useful. And if you've got a well-developed theory in medicine, for example, and you've done lots of basic science in order to have this well-developed theory, then you can implement it. And maybe if it's in a population where the biological organism is quite is very similar within a species, maybe it's going to work. But in the social sciences, we know that context can be very different. We know that history plays a role. We know that time plays a role. And we need to have methods which help reflect that more open system. And we need to be able to understand why things are working and perhaps why they're not as well.
Yeah. So what you are telling is that there might be some more work to do in terms of when you're asking questions for whom, why, and looking at the context as well. But it also means some work for qualitative researchers, because they are often the experts in figuring out people's people's intentions and all these mechanisms that are underpinning that might not, if you're just measuring whether the change happened or not, you don't really know how the people in this environment interpret what's going on and why they were doing what they did, for example, when we talk about behavior change.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is good news for qualitative researchers and qualitative research itself. I think process evaluations are being used in randomized controlled trials a lot more often, but also more than that, it's not just the process evaluation, it's also trying to understand, like you said, what's going on, what are these people's experiences, what are their motivations, what does this intervention mean to them? And these are all things that qualitative research does very well. It's very good at ultimately trying to understand the experience of other humans. This is something that humans are very good at doing. So people do this much better than machines do at the moment. But machines can hold lots of data and lots of information better than we can. But we're very good at understanding each other. So I think this is where qualitative research really comes into its own. And I think seeing this stuff more in research grants and large studies is certainly a good sign for qualitative researchers.
Yeah, definitely. And what was mentioned about mixed methods or quantitative and qualitative, what we talked about in the beginning, that within critical realism, you can use them both, or you're encouraged to use all the methods that you can to figure out what's going on. So it's fine to use those surveys. It's fine to use your observations, interventions, use whatever you can to figure out what you need to know.
Exactly. So methodological pluralism is a term that's used quite often within the realist evaluation and realist synthesis, but also within critical realist work as well. So we're trying to add to a pool of theory. We're trying to explain things. And I think it also reflects the nature of the world. So there are things which can be counted. There may be a number of different people who have this experience out of 100, for example, and it might be good to know whether there's one person or there's 99 people who are having this particular experience. But then beyond that, within each person, they may have an experience which is maybe very, very mild, very, they maybe feel, if they're quite low mood, for example, it might be very mild, but they also might have an experience which is very, very extreme, very, very intense, sadness, depression, something like that, for example. The idea that you can have different intensities of the same kind of experience is surely something which says that quantitative methods may be quite useful, in that that might be helpful to show a different intensity or amplitude of an experience. So the nature of the world, there are some things which can be counted, measured, and whether we do it that accurately or not is another question. But I think there's a sense there. But then, of course, like you said, there's also things that are not so easily measured. There are different types and different forms of things that are which we describe as which we can describe qualitatively much more effectively. So to me, you need to bring all these things together to understand the world in its full complexity, and not entirely dismiss one because they're in a different paradigm for you.
Yeah. And when you mentioned about open systems, and sometimes we will find something that takes us by surprise that we couldn't anticipate. So if we have our surveys, for example, we might not figure out to ask about something. But then as qualitative researchers, we are also more open-ended, and we can discover things that were not a part of our theory in the beginning. So that's also a benefit of kind of combining the methods.
Exactly, yeah. And I think we've all had that experience when we're trying to fill out surveys and questionnaires where you as a participant, you try and give an answer, but you think, well, actually, it's not that simple, or you may want to say it depends, or from time to time. And those sorts of things aren't very. You can't really capture that in a survey very well. So certainly there's value there. But being able to develop it and being able to work within that open system, which is always changing over time, I think is really important.
Yeah. This has been really great. Let's finish up in a moment. I think I'd like to have a little reflection on kind of the practicalities when you're doing this work and when you're kind of presenting it to people and you're submitting a paper to be reviewed and eventually hopefully published. So, I mean, one of the issues that comes across is that the terminology, you already talked about the bad words, so truth. Qualitative researchers might not like the term validity or accuracy, or causality is one of those horrible words as well that you're not supposed to use. And I've sometimes had a reviewer kind of picking up on those things that, for example, if I talk about accurate interpretation, and that's something that is kind of flagged that my terminology is wrong in a sense. So I wonder if you had those experiences and kind of how to go about that when your discussion partner might be within a different framework.
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing to say, as you and I both know, having gone through this process together in submitting papers from this perspective, is that I'll try and answer this, but I don't necessarily have the answers because I've kind of rejected on occasions, and you end up maybe getting into an argument with someone from a different perspective, when ideally you wouldn't get into that argument, or that the argument is resolvable. It's okay to have arguments, obviously, if you want to dispute things, but if you're able to work towards resolving things, that's the ideal situation. If you can defend it properly and if you can justify it, and then a reviewer accepts your justification, or provide some useful constructive feedback, then that is the ultimate goal, I suppose. But having not always reached that conclusion, I suppose. I think there's positives to be said in that there are lots of people doing realist research, critical realist research. In fact, like I said earlier, I think this is often people's common assumption, and the common way of a common sense way of going through the world is one where it's you may assume there's an external reality, but your knowledge of it is slightly is context and concept dependent. So I do think people do accept this, and there are lots of people who work under these assumptions either implicitly or explicitly. So I think there are other people out there, so it's not like it's difficult to do. I remember once writing a grant application, a proposal for a study where it was supposed to be a realist evaluation methodology, and I was very defensive about it. I was assuming that it might come to either someone who is more used to randomized controlled trials on the one hand, or someone who comes from a very qualitative paradigm on the other hand. So I was very defensive in it, and actually one of the reviews came back and said, no, this is actually a very well established method. Lots of people do this, so you don't need to be so defensive. So actually, I think that sometimes there's just because there's some people who are critical of it and don't like these words, truth, accuracy, validity, cause. There are lots of other people who, and probably a growing community, who are familiar and happy to use this language. So I suspect that like most shifts, most movements and trends in science, it takes a while to convince people one way or another. So there are. I suspect that it will maybe take some time in order to get enough people out there who are versed in realism, critical realist methods, in order for journal editors to be able to send a review, to send it out to review to someone who's familiar with this. So they're not so I don't object to it so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for me, one of talking more pessimistically might be one thing that I think stops different movements from happening and different arguments from taking place is actually the general paradigmatic approach, which I think we've touched on. But when I say paradigmatic approach, I mean an approach to the field of academia in which there are different paradigms which are incommensurable. So if you take the assumption that, let's say, a PhD student or early career researcher needs to find one of these paradigms and then spend the rest of their career working within that paradigm and then only having a conversation within people in that paradigm, that's one way of doing things. And that paradigm is protected from critique from people in a different paradigm. So this is a kind of paradigmatic approach where people kind of agree to disagree and they go their separate ways and they use a language which is familiar to them and assumptions which are familiar to them. And importantly, they're not exposed to critique from other paradigms. I think for me that is potentially something which would prevent some. What it does is it prevents the very idea that better approaches can be developed. So the idea of advancing or progressing science and knowledge rests in the idea that one theory could be replaced by a different theory. It doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect theory, but it can be replaced because it maybe matches with the more data than the previous theory, or that it helps explain things more coherently than the previous theory. There's less kind of anomalies within that theory. So the idea that you can shift from one theory to another based on it being actually a little bit better is kind of blocked by this paradigms approach, because if you work towards, let's say if we were working in this critical realist paradigm now, we simply would just work with other people who agree with us and never meet anyone else from any other paradigm, and we only evaluate things within our own paradigm. So for me that's a problem, because not only, well, for one, it prevents anyone else from critiquing us, really, and which is a problem, and it prevents us from being able to critique anyone else. So I think being able to actually engage in rational discussions where we are actually attempting to point out where there are mistakes, errors, issues of coherence and compatibility which could be refined. I think that gets blocked by a paradigms approach, and I think that's something that we've probably experienced in the past. Is any attempt to do something which you maybe see as I'm trying not to use the word more advanced, but that's kind of where I'm going. I'm something which helps explain reality a little bit better than previously. I think it's something which gets blocked by saying, look, that's just your perspective and this is my perspective, and we're all just working in different paradigms, and we can't critique each other. I think that's actually a problem for developing methodology.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and kind of the emphasis of kind of positioning your work and positioning yourself, that kind of, if we are emphasizing that too much, that might actually be harmful for kind of developing our understanding and kind of trying to figure out how we are wrong.
Yeah.
and looking outside, that we shouldn't emphasize too much that you have to figure out where you are, and that's it in terms of the paradigms.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's described. It almost feels like you're trying to make a choice between, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream or something.
Yeah.
And one's not better than another. It's just your personal preference, and you may identify with a particular position and see yourself in a certain way. Or maybe like a style of music where it will have something strongly with your own identity. But actually, I think it's important to not think like that, because it probably isn't. These are just methods, and what's important is what's happening in the real world, and we need to happily discard any of our methods if they're causing problems, and if there are holes in the arguments. So I think yes, it's and I'm not saying that realism and critical realism is perfect, but for me, I think it explains. It has maybe less holes in it than other approaches, and I think it's something which I will continue to use and continue to listen to people who criticize it, and hopefully they can advance my own understanding of it and advance the field of it if they can see some mistakes and problems in it, and that's how we progress as a community.
Yeah. So that's something that's, when you mentioned that critical realism has been out there for quite a while already, but we don't have it so much when we talk about physical activity research and sport and exercise research. So I really hope that you continue developing your work and that others will be kind of bringing this approach in as well, so that people can then kind of evaluate whether that's something that might be one way of kind of moving our discipline forward and helping us do better work.
And you too, Nora.
So thanks so much for your time. I think we covered a lot of different things, and I hope that this is interesting and in some ways useful to our listeners as well. So let's finish up for today. Thanks so much, Gareth.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
This podcast is sponsored by Fibion. Get scientific validation and learn more about Fibion at fibion.com/research. The Physical Activity Researcher podcast has created an activity tracker purchase guide for researchers. Get your free copy from the link in the podcast description.
Thank you for listening to the Physical Activity Researcher podcast.